My name is Ben Carter, and for the past 7 years, I've been a park ranger here in the Appalachian National Park. It's a damn good job, most of the time. You get to spend your days surrounded by some of the most beautiful scenery in the country, the kind of views that make you feel small in the best possible way. The air is clean, the wildlife is abundant, and the rhythm of life out here is slow and steady, dictated by the changing seasons rather than the frantic pace of the cities. I've always been an outdoorsman, ever since I was a kid growing up in rural Pennsylvania. This job isn't just a paycheck for me, it's a way of life. My main responsibilities involve patrolling the trails, assisting hikers, educating visitors about the park's flora and fauna, and of course, keeping an eye on the wildlife. We have a healthy population of black bears, white-tailed deer, coyotes, bobcats, and more recently, a growing number of wolves. The reintroduction of wolves to certain parts of the Appalachians has been a controversial topic, but from an ecological standpoint, it's been largely successful. They help to keep the deer population in check, which in turn benefits the overall health of the forest. For the most part, the wolves we've encountered have been behaving as expected. They're generally elusive creatures, preferring to avoid human contact. Sightings are relatively rare, usually just a fleeting glimpse of a grey shadow disappearing into the underbrush, or the distant sound of their howls echoing through the mountains at night. We brief hikers on how to react if they do encounter a wolf. Basically, make yourself look big, make noise, and back away slowly. Attacks on humans are incredibly rare, almost unheard of in this region. However, lately, things have been different. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, a series of small anomalies that I initially dismissed as my imagination, or perhaps just the natural variations in animal behavior, but the oddities have become more frequent, more pronounced, and frankly, more unsettling. The first thing I noticed was the sheer number of wolves we were seeing. It wasn't just the occasional lone wolf or a small pack, it was like they were everywhere. During my patrols, I started encountering them more and more frequently, sometimes multiple times a day. This in itself wasn't necessarily alarming. The population could be expanding, or perhaps they were more active due to some environmental factor, like a particularly harsh winter making prey harder to find. But it wasn't just the numbers, it was where we were seeing them. Wolves are typically wary of human activity and tend to stick to the more remote, less trafficked areas of the park. Lately, however, they've been venturing closer to trails, campgrounds, and even the park's administrative buildings. I've had reports from other rangers about seeing them near the visitor center, which is practically unheard of. These aren't bold, aggressive encounters. The wolves usually just watch from a distance, their eyes fixed on the humans, before silently melting back into the woods. It's the unnerving stillness of their gaze that gets to you. Then there's the way they're moving. Wolves are graceful animals, their movements fluid and purposeful. But lately, I've witnessed them moving in ways that just don't seem natural. I've seen packs of them moving in perfect unison, their steps synchronized as if they were following some silent command. It's like watching a perfectly choreographed dance, but there's something deeply unsettling about it when it's a group of wild predators. One afternoon, I was hiking along the Appalachian Trail, about 10 miles north of Springer Mountain, checking on some trail markers. The area was quiet, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. Suddenly, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of wolves howling. It wasn't the typical mournful howl that sends shivers down your spine in a good way. This was different. It was higher pitched, almost like a whine, but with an underlying guttural tone that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw them. There were at least 15 wolves gathered in a small clearing, their heads raised to the sky, their bodies pressed close together. The sound they were making was eerie, a cacophony of howls and whines that seemed to vibrate through the very air. But the strangest thing was their formation. They were arranged in a perfect circle, facing inwards, as if they were observing something in the center of the clearing. I cautiously approached, my hand instinctively resting on the pepper spray attached to my belt. As I got closer, the howling stopped abruptly. The wolves turned their heads in unison, their eyes, glowing with an unnatural intensity, fixed on me. It was a chilling sight, dozens of pairs of yellow eyes staring at me, without a hint of fear or aggression, just observation. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Then, slowly, one by one, the wolves turned back to the center of the clearing. I strained my eyes to see what had captured their attention, but there was nothing there. Just bare earth and a few scattered leaves. Confused and slightly unnerved, I continued along the trail, keeping a close watch on my surroundings. When I glanced back at the clearing a few minutes later, the wolves were gone. There was no sign that they had ever been there, no tracks in the dirt, no lingering scent in the air. It was as if they had simply vanished. That incident stuck with me. It was the first time I felt a genuine sense of unease about the wolves' behavior. It wasn't just unusual, it felt wrong. Since then, the strange occurrences have continued. Hikers have reported seeing groups of wolves standing silently at the edge of the woods, watching them as they pass. One group even claimed that the wolves seemed to be following them for a short distance, keeping pace just out of sight. Another ranger, a young woman named Sarah, who's been with the park for about 3 years, told me about an incident that happened near one of the backcountry shelters. She was on patrol and heard a commotion near the shelter. When she went to investigate, she found a group of 6 or 7 wolves surrounding the shelter. They weren't attacking it or trying to get inside, they were just there, sitting and staring at the structure. When Sarah approached, they simply got up and walked away, their movements strangely deliberate and coordinated. We've also noticed a change in their vocalizations. The usual howls and yips have been replaced by these strange, almost musical sounds. Sometimes, late at night, when the park is quiet, you can hear these high-pitched, wavering calls that sound less like animal communication and more like something else. It's hard to describe, but there's an unsettling melody to it, a haunting quality that makes your skin crawl. The most disturbing incident happened just a few days ago. I was called out to investigate a report from a group of campers in the Elkmont campground. They claimed that they had been woken up in the middle of the night by a pack of wolves surrounding their tents. According to them, the wolves didn't make a sound. They just stood there, in the darkness, their eyes reflecting the faint light of the moon. The campers were terrified and huddled inside their tents until dawn, when the wolves finally dispersed. When I arrived at the campground the next morning, I found no evidence of the wolves. No tracks, no droppings, nothing. It was as if the whole thing had been a bad dream, but the campers were adamant about what they had seen, and they were understandably shaken. I've been trying to rationalize all of this. Maybe there's a disease affecting the wolves, causing them to behave erratically. Maybe there's a change in their food source that's driving them to seek out new areas. Maybe it's just a temporary anomaly, and things will eventually return to normal. But deep down, I have a bad feeling about this. There's something fundamentally wrong with the way these wolves are acting. It's like they're not just wild animals anymore. There's an intelligence in their eyes, a coordination in their movements, that feels unnatural. I've started keeping a log of all the strange wolf sightings and behaviors. I don't know what it means, but I feel like I need to document it, just in case. I've also started carrying a larger can of bear spray and keeping my sidearm, which I rarely ever need, a little closer at hand. The peace and tranquility of the Appalachian National Park are starting to feel tainted. There's a sense of unease that hangs in the air, a feeling that something is not right in the woods. And the wolves, they're at the center of it all. Their strange movements, their silent vigils, their haunting calls, they're all pieces of a puzzle that I don't yet understand, but I have a growing fear of what the complete picture might look like. The sun is starting to set now, casting long shadows across the mountains. The air is getting colder, and the sounds of the forest are changing as the nocturnal creatures begin to stir. I'm on patrol, driving along one of the park's main roads. As I round a bend, my headlights illuminate a pair of eyes reflecting in the darkness at the edge of the woods. It's a wolf. It stands perfectly still, watching my vehicle approach. As I slow down, more wolves emerge from the trees, their numbers growing rapidly. Soon, there are at least a dozen of them, standing silently by the side of the road, their eyes fixed on me. I stop the truck, my heart pounding in my chest. I reach for my radio, but hesitate. What would I even say? I'm surrounded by a bunch of wolves acting weird. It sounds ridiculous, even to me. The wolves don't move. They just stand there watching. There's no aggression in their posture, but there's something else, something unsettlingly intelligent in their gaze. It's like they're waiting. I put the truck in park and turn off the engine. The silence that descends is broken only by the gentle chirping of crickets. The wolves continue to stare, their eyes glowing in the darkness. I don't know what they want. I don't know what's happening. But I have a feeling that whatever it is, it's only just beginning, and I'm right in the middle of it. This is Ben Carter, signing off for the night. I have a feeling tomorrow is going to be a long one, and I have an even stronger feeling that whatever is happening in these woods is far more sinister than I can currently imagine. The wolves are changing, and I fear that the park, and maybe even I, will never be the same. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant hoot of an owl. The wolves remained still, their eyes like glowing embers in the encroaching darkness. I sat in my truck, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to keep my breathing steady. My mind raced, searching for a logical explanation, but coming up empty. This wasn't normal wolf behavior, not even close. After what felt like an eternity, one of the wolves, a large male with a thick, grey coat, took a single step forward. Then another. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost curious. The other wolves remained in place, watching. The large male approached the front of my truck and stopped a few feet away, its gaze fixed on me through the windshield. Its eyes were intelligent, almost unnervingly so. It tilted its head slightly, as if it were studying me. I swallowed hard, my hand inching towards the bear spray on the console. Should I try to scare it away? Should I honk the horn? I hesitated. Something told me that conventional methods might not work here. There was an air of control about these animals that was deeply unsettling. Then the wolf did something that sent a fresh wave of chills down my spine. It raised a paw and placed it on the hood of my truck. The claws made a soft scratching sound against the metal. It wasn't an aggressive act, it was more like an inspection. The wolf then lowered its head and sniffed at the hood, its breath misting in the cool night air. After a moment, it lifted its head and looked directly into my eyes again. There was a strange intensity in its gaze, a flicker of something that I couldn't quite decipher. It held my gaze for several long seconds before slowly retracting its paw and stepping back. It then turned its head slightly to the side, and a low, guttural sound rumbled in its chest. It wasn't a growl, it was more like a vocalization, but unlike any wolf sound I had ever heard. As if on cue, the other wolves began to move. They didn't disperse or run away. Instead, they started to circle my truck, their movements fluid and silent. They kept a respectful distance, but their presence was palpable, a ring of watchful eyes in the darkness. I felt a knot of fear tighten in my stomach. I was surrounded, and these animals were behaving in a way that defied all logic and understanding. I knew I had to do something, but I was paralyzed by a sense of the uncanny. Finally, I decided to try the radio. I picked up the handset and pressed the transmit button. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Carter. Do you read?" Silence. Only the faint static of the radio filled the cab of my truck. I tried again, speaking louder this time. "Dispatch, Ranger Carter, reporting unusual wolf activity on County Road 7 near the eastern boundary. I am currently surrounded by approximately a dozen wolves exhibiting strange behavior, requesting assistance." Still nothing. I checked the radio. It was on, the signal strength was good. Why wasn't I getting through? Was it a dead spot? It was possible, but unlikely in this area. I tried calling on my personal cell phone. No signal. Of course, I was on my own. The wolves continued their silent vigil around my truck. The large male that had approached the hood let out another of those strange vocalizations, a low wavering sound that seemed to carry a hint of something. Sadness? Curiosity? I couldn't tell. After what felt like an eternity, the circling stopped. The wolves gathered again at the edge of the road, their eyes still fixed on me. Then, slowly, one by one, they turned and disappeared back into the darkness of the woods. The large male was the last to leave. It stood at the edge of the trees for a moment, looking back at me, before finally melting into the shadows. I sat there for a long time, my heart still pounding, trying to process what had just happened. What did it mean? Why did they just leave? And what was with that strange behavior? I eventually started the truck and slowly drove back to the ranger station. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just occurred. The next morning, I went straight to park headquarters to talk to Chief Miller. He's a seasoned ranger, been in the park for over 30 years. If anyone would have an explanation for this, it would be him. I recounted the events of the previous night, trying to remain calm and factual, despite the underlying unease I felt. Chief Miller listened intently, his brow furrowed in thought. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Ben, we've had a few other reports of unusual wolf activity lately. Nothing quite like what you described, but enough to raise some eyebrows. Hikers reporting being watched, strange vocalizations. Sarah mentioned seeing a group of them just standing around that old abandoned cabin near Blackrock. So, you think something's going on?" I asked, feeling a sliver of validation. "I don't know, Ben," he replied, rubbing his chin. "It could be a number of things. Maybe a new pack dynamic, or some kind of environmental stress. We've contacted the state wildlife biologists. They're sending a team out next week to try and get a better handle on the situation. But Chief," I pressed, "it didn't feel like anything natural. The way they moved, the way they looked at me, it was like they were intelligent, in a way I've never seen in an animal before." Chief Miller nodded slowly. "I understand your concern, Ben, and I'm not dismissing what you experienced. Just try to stay vigilant, and report anything else you see. In the meantime, we'll let the experts take a look." I left Chief Miller's office, feeling somewhat reassured, but the knot of unease in my stomach remained. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a change in animal behavior. Over the next few days, the strange wolf sightings continued. Other rangers reported similar encounters, groups of wolves appearing in unusual locations, their movements coordinated, their gazes unnervingly intense. The strange vocalizations became more frequent, echoing through the valleys at night, a haunting melody that seemed to carry on the wind. Hikers became increasingly nervous. Reports of feeling watched by unseen eyes in the woods started to come in daily. Some even claimed to have seen the wolves moving in formations, like they were following some unseen leader. The atmosphere in the park was changing. The usual sense of peace and tranquility was being replaced by a growing feeling of apprehension. People were starting to look over their shoulders, and the trails were becoming noticeably less crowded. One afternoon, I decided to revisit the area where I had first encountered the wolves in the clearing. I wanted to see if I could find any clues, anything that might explain their strange behavior. I hiked back to the spot, the memory of the silent circle of wolves still vivid in my mind. The clearing looked the same as I remembered it, just bare earth and a few scattered leaves. I walked around, carefully examining the ground, but found nothing out of the ordinary. As I was about to leave, I noticed something glinting in the underbrush near the edge of the clearing. I bent down and pushed aside some leaves to reveal a small, intricately carved wooden figure. It was a crude representation of a wolf, but the details were surprisingly well done. The eyes were small, dark beads that seemed to stare back at me. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It felt old, the wood worn smooth with time. Where had it come from? Had someone left it here? It seemed out of place, almost ritualistic. I pocketed the figure and continued to explore the area. A little further into the woods, I stumbled upon something even more unsettling. It was a small, circular area where the ground had been cleared of all vegetation. In the center of the clearing was a pile of stones arranged in a strange, spiral pattern. I cautiously approached the stone pile. There was something about it that felt wrong. An unnatural stillness hung in the air around it. As I got closer, I noticed something placed carefully on top of the stones, a single white feather. I felt a prickle of fear run down my spine. This wasn't just unusual animal behavior anymore. This felt deliberate, intentional. It was like I had stumbled upon some kind of ritual site. I quickly took a few pictures of the stone pile and the feather with my phone, then decided it was time to leave. The woods suddenly felt darker, more menacing. I had a strong sense that I was not alone, that unseen eyes were watching me from the shadows. I hurried back to the trail, my pace quickening. As I walked, I couldn't shake the image of the wooden wolf figure and the strange stone pile from my mind. What did it all mean? When I got back to the ranger station, I showed Chief Miller the pictures and the wooden figure. He looked at them with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Where did you find this, Ben?" he asked, holding the wooden wolf in his hand. I told him about the clearing and the stone pile. He listened intently, his expression growing increasingly serious. "I don't like this," he said finally. "This isn't normal. I think it's time we increase patrols in that area, and I'm going to call the state police. Maybe they can shed some light on this." Over the next few days, the situation in the park continued to deteriorate. The wolf activity became more frequent and more brazen. Hikers reported being surrounded by silent packs of wolves on the trails. Some even claimed that the wolves seemed to be herding them, guiding them in specific directions. One particularly disturbing report came from a group of backpackers who were hiking the AT near Roan Mountain. They claimed that they had been followed for miles by a large group of wolves, who stayed just out of sight in the trees, but whose presence was undeniable. They said they could hear their soft footfalls on the leaves and catch glimpses of their grey shapes through the underbrush. The strange vocalizations intensified, becoming more complex and melodic. Some rangers even reported hearing what sounded like chanting, carried on the wind from the depths of the forest. Fear began to grip the small communities surrounding the park. Local news outlets picked up the story, and rumors started to spread about strange creatures and unexplained occurrences in the Appalachian wilderness. The state wildlife biologists arrived and began their investigation. They set up tracking cameras and tried to capture some of the wolves for examination, but the wolves seemed to be avoiding their traps, as if they knew they were there. One of the biologists, a young woman named Dr. Emily Carter, no relation, told me that the few scat samples they had managed to collect were unusual. They contained traces of things that wolves wouldn't normally eat, including some kind of unknown plant matter, and what appeared to be bone fragments that didn't match any of the local wildlife. Things were escalating quickly, and the sense of unease was growing into outright fear. The park, once a place of peace and natural beauty, was beginning to feel like something much darker, Something ancient and malevolent was stirring within its depths. And the wolves, with their strange behavior and knowing eyes, were at the heart of it all. I had a terrible feeling that whatever was happening was far from over, and that we were only just beginning to scratch the surface of a terrifying mystery. The wildlife biologist's initial findings only deepened the mystery. Dr. Carter, a sharp and dedicated researcher, was visibly perplexed. The bone fragments, they're unlike anything I've ever seen. They're too dense to be from any of the animals we have in the park, and the structure is odd. We're sending them to a lab for further analysis, but honestly, I have no idea what they could be. The unknown plant matter was equally baffling. It wasn't any species native to the region, and it seemed to have some unusual properties. Dr. Carter mentioned that it emitted a faint, almost imperceptible odor, something vaguely sweet, but with an undertone of something else, something metallic and faintly rotten. Meanwhile, the strange wolf activity continued unabated. One morning, Sarah came into the ranger station looking pale and shaken. She recounted an experience from her patrol the previous day that had clearly rattled her. "I was near Hemlock Falls," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard the vocalizations again, the ones that sound like singing. I decided to try and get closer, see if I could get a recording. I moved quietly through the woods, and then I saw them." She paused, taking a deep breath. There were at least 20 of them gathered in a small clearing. They weren't just standing around, they were moving together. It was like a slow, deliberate dance. They would step forward, then back, their movements perfectly synchronized. And the sound, it was clearer than ever. It wasn't just howling or yipping. It sounded like actual singing, Ben. Like they were chanting something. I exchanged a worried glance with Chief Miller. Sarah was a level-headed ranger, not prone to exaggeration. If she said she saw and heard something like that, then it likely happened. "Did you get a recording, Sarah?" Chief Miller asked. She shook her head. "No. As soon as they saw me, they stopped. They just turned and stared, all of them. It was the same feeling you described, Ben. Like they were aware, in a way that's not normal." The reports kept coming in. A group of birdwatchers claimed to have seen a large pack of wolves arranged in a perfect circle around an old, gnarled oak tree, their heads bowed as if in reverence. Another hiker reported finding a series of small, meticulously constructed cairns along a rarely used trail, each topped with a single white feather, identical to the one I had found near the stone pile. The line between unusual animal behavior and something truly bizarre was becoming increasingly blurred. The atmosphere in the park was thick with a sense of foreboding. Even the most experienced rangers were starting to feel uneasy. Chief Miller decided to close off some of the more remote trails and issued a warning to visitors, advising them to hike in groups and to be extra cautious. The local news was having a field day, with sensational headlines and interviews with frightened residents. Some people were even starting to speculate about supernatural forces at play in the ancient mountains. I couldn't shake the feeling that the wooden wolf figure and the stone pile were significant. I spent hours poring over old park maps and historical records, trying to find any mention of similar occurrences or any information about the area where I had found them. I discovered that the clearing was located near the site of an old, abandoned settlement that had been abandoned in the early 1900s. There were rumors that the settlers had practiced some unusual folk beliefs, but nothing concrete. One evening, I decided to go back to the clearing. I wanted to spend more time there, see if I had missed anything. I went alone, armed with my bear spray and my sedam, the unease gnawing at me. The sun was beginning to set as I reached the clearing. The air was still and quiet, the shadows lengthening across the forest floor. I walked to the stone pile and examined it closely. The spiral pattern was deliberate, almost hypnotic. The white feather still lay on top, undisturbed. As I circled the pile, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Tucked between two of the stones was another small wooden figure, identical in style to the wolf I had found earlier. This one was shaped like a deer, its antlers intricately carved. I carefully pulled it out. It felt just as old and worn as the wolf. I felt a growing sense of dread. This wasn't random. Someone or something was placing these figures here. I continued to search the clearing, my eyes scanning the underbrush. Then I saw it, a series of faint tracks in the soft earth near the edge of the woods. They were wolf tracks, but they were unlike any I had ever seen before. They were larger, deeper, and seemed to have a more defined pattern, almost like they were deliberately placed. I followed the tracks into the trees. They led me deeper into the woods, away from the clearing. The forest grew darker and quieter, the air heavy with a sense of ancientness. The tracks continued for a while, then suddenly stopped, as if the creature had simply vanished. As I stood there, surrounded by the deepening twilight, I heard it again, the singing. It was faint at first, carried on the breeze, but it grew louder as I listened. It seemed to be coming from further into the woods, in the direction the tracks had been leading. My heart pounded in my chest. Curiosity and a growing sense of fear warred within me. Should I follow the sound, or should I turn back? Against my better judgment, I decided to go forward. I moved slowly and cautiously, my senses on high alert. The singing grew louder, more distinct. It was definitely a chant, a series of high-pitched, wavering sounds that seemed to echo through the trees. It sounded almost ritualistic. After walking for what felt like a long time, I reached a small, hidden valley. In the center of the valley, bathed in the eerie glow of the rising moon, was a sight that made my blood run cold. There were dozens of wolves gathered in the valley, arranged in a large circle. In the center of the circle was a fire, burning with an unnatural blue flame. Around the fire, several of the wolves were standing upright on their hind legs, their front paws raised as if in supplication. They were the ones chanting, their voices creating the haunting melody that I had been hearing. I watched in stunned silence, hidden behind a thicket of trees. This couldn't be real. Wolves didn't stand on their hind legs. They didn't chant. What was I witnessing? As I watched, one of the upright wolves stepped forward and tossed something into the blue flames. I couldn't see what it was clearly, but it looked like another one of the wooden figures. As the figure hit the flames, the chanting intensified, and the blue fire flared even brighter. Then, one of the wolves in the circle turned its head and looked directly at my hiding place. Its eyes glowed with an intense, unnatural light. It was as if it knew I was there. A low growl rumbled in its chest, and then it let out a piercing howl that echoed through the valley. Immediately, the chanting stopped, and all the wolves in the circle turned their heads towards me. Fear surged through me, cold and sharp. I knew I had been seen. There was no time to think. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, the sounds of the wolves behind me. I could hear their howls and yips, but there was something else too, the sound of their paws pounding on the ground, closer than they should have been. I glanced back and saw them, moving with incredible speed and agility, their eyes glowing in the darkness. They were gaining on me. I knew I couldn't outrun them. I veered off the trail, hoping to lose them in the dense woods. I scrambled over fallen logs and pushed through thickets, my lungs burning, my heart pounding. Suddenly, I tripped and fell, hitting the ground hard. I scrambled to my feet, but the wolves were already upon me. They circled me, their teeth bared, their eyes filled with a predatory hunger that was far beyond anything I had ever seen in a wild animal. I raised my can of bear spray, my hand shaking. This was it. This was how it was going to end. But then, just as they were about to lunge, they stopped. They stood there, their bodies tense, their eyes fixed on something behind me. I slowly turned my head. Standing at the edge of the trees was the large grey wolf I had encountered on the road. It was bigger than the others, its eyes glowing with an even more intense light. It let out a low growl, and the other wolves immediately backed away, their eyes still fixed on me, but their aggression seemingly subdued. The large wolf slowly approached me, its gaze unwavering. I stood frozen, my bear spray still in my hand, unsure of what to do. It stopped a few feet away and looked directly into my eyes. There was no aggression in its gaze now, only that strange, unnerving intelligence. Then, it did something that defied all explanation. It spoke. The sound was low and guttural, but there was no mistaking it. It was a voice, speaking in a language I didn't understand, but somehow felt. The words seemed to resonate in my mind, filled with a power and an ancient wisdom that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. I stood there, paralyzed by fear and disbelief, as the wolf continued to speak, its words weaving a tapestry of dread and understanding in the silent forest. The blue fire in the valley flickered, casting eerie shadows among the trees, and the other wolves watched, their eyes glowing in the darkness, as the ancient secrets of the Appalachian wilderness began to be revealed. I don't know how long it spoke, but it felt like an eternity. The words seemed to burrow into my mind, rewriting my understanding of the world, of nature, of everything. Finally, the wolf stopped speaking. It simply looked at me for a long moment, its intelligent eyes seeming to peer into my very soul. Then, it turned and walked back towards the valley, the other wolves following silently behind. I stood there, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was I hallucinating? The lingering sense of dread, the echo of the ancient words in my mind, told me that it was real. Something profound and terrifying was happening in these mountains, something that defied all logic and reason. And I was caught in the middle of it. I knew I had to get out of there, to tell someone what I had seen. But a part of me knew that no one would believe me. How could they? I barely believed it myself. As I stumbled back towards the trail, The haunting melody of the wolves chanting echoed through the trees, a chilling reminder of the ancient power that now stirred within the Appalachian National Park. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that things would never be the same again. The trek back to the ranger station felt like a fever dream. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through me. The image of the upright wolves chanting around the blue fire, the sound of the ancient voice echoing in my mind, it was all too surreal, too impossible to be real. Yet, the raw terror I had felt was undeniable. When I finally stumbled into the ranger station, the lights were on, and a few of the night crew were on duty. Sarah looked up in surprise as I burst through the door, my face pale and my clothes torn. "Ben? What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost. Worse." I managed to gasp out, my voice hoarse. Much worse. I tried to explain what I had seen, the words tumbling out in a rush, disjointed and frantic. The chanting, the blue fire, the wolves standing upright. The voice, I knew how it sounded, how unbelievable it must seem. Sarah and the other rangers listened with a mixture of concern and disbelief. Chief Miller, who had been working late, came out of his office, his expression grave. "Ben, calm down. Take a breath and tell me what happened." I tried to recount the events in a more coherent manner, but the sheer absurdity of it all made it difficult. I showed them the pictures of the stone pile and the wooden figures on my phone. Chief Miller examined them closely, his brow furrowed. "This is strange, Ben." But the rest, wolves talking, blue fire. I could see the skepticism in his eyes, and I didn't blame him. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I wouldn't have believed it either. "I know how it sounds, Chief," I said, my voice strained. "But I swear it's the truth. There's something wrong with those wolves, something ancient and powerful." Chief Miller sighed. "Okay, Ben, you've been through a lot. Let's get you some rest. We can talk more in the morning." But I couldn't rest. The images kept flashing through my mind, the voice still echoing in my ears. I knew I couldn't just let it go. Something had fundamentally changed in the park, and I felt a responsibility to understand what was happening. The next morning, I insisted on taking Chief Miller to the hidden valley. I described the location as best as I could, and we set out with a small team of rangers, all of us armed and on high alert. We hiked for hours, following my vague directions. When we finally reached the area where I thought the valley was, there was nothing there. Just dense forest, the ground covered in leaves and underbrush. There was no sign of a clearing, no trace of a fire, no indication that dozens of wolves had been there the night before. Chief Miller and the other rangers exchanged uneasy glances. I felt a wave of frustration and despair wash over me. Had it all been a hallucination? Had the stress and lack of sleep finally gotten to me? We searched the area thoroughly, but found nothing. Eventually, Chief Miller called off the search. "Ben, I appreciate you bringing this to our attention, but maybe you did see something that wasn't quite what you thought it was. Stress can do strange things." I knew what he was implying. He thought I had imagined it. Back at the station, Dr. Carter and her team were packing up their equipment. I asked her if they had made any more progress with their analysis. "We got the results back from the lab," she said, her expression troubled. "The bone fragments, they're not from any known animal, living or extinct. The composition is unlike anything in our database. As for the plant matter, we've identified it as a species of fungus, but one that shouldn't be growing in this environment, and it has some unusual psychoactive properties." Psychoactive. That word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Could I have been hallucinating? Was the strange behavior of the wolves somehow linked to this fungus? But even if the fungus could explain the chanting and the strange gatherings, it couldn't explain the blue fire or the voice. Over the next few weeks, the strange wolf activity continued, albeit with less intensity. The large gatherings seemed to have stopped, but the chanting became less frequent. But the feeling of unease in the park remained. Hikers were still reporting unsettling encounters, and the local communities were still on edge. I continued my patrols, always with a heightened sense of awareness. I kept a close eye on the woods, listening for any unusual sounds, watching for any sign of the strange behavior I had witnessed. Then, one cold, clear morning, I found something new. I was hiking along a remote trail that had been closed to the public due to the wolf activity. As I rounded a bend, I saw it a small, intricately carved wooden figure lying in the middle of the path. It was another wolf, identical in style to the one I had found in the clearing. This time, however, there was something different about it. Its eyes, instead of being made of dark beads, were two small, perfectly round pieces of polished obsidian. They seemed to gleam in the sunlight, and they held a strange, unsettling intensity. I cautiously approached the figure and bent down to pick it up. As my fingers brushed against the smooth wood, I felt a jolt, a sudden surge of energy that made my head spin. Images flashed through my mind: the blue fire, the chanting wolves, the ancient voice. It was like a memory, but not my own. I quickly dropped the figure, my heart pounding. There was something about it, something powerful. I decided to take it back to the ranger station. I showed it to Chief Miller and Dr. Carter. They were both intrigued by the obsidian eyes. "We haven't seen anything like this before," Dr. Carter said, examining the figure closely. "The craftsmanship is remarkable, but the materials are unusual." That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the wooden wolf with its obsidian eyes kept haunting me. I had a strong feeling that it was a key to understanding what was happening in the park. In the early hours of the morning, I woke up with a start. I had a sudden, overwhelming urge to go back to the trail where I had found the figure. I didn't know why, but I felt like I needed to be there. I got dressed quickly and drove back to the trailhead. The sun was just beginning to rise as I started hiking. The forest was quiet, the air crisp and cold. As I reached the spot where I had found the wooden wolf, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. The figure was gone. In its place was a single, white feather, identical to the ones I had found before. I looked around, my senses on high alert. The woods seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Then I heard it, the singing. It was faint at first, but it grew louder as I listened, seeming to come from deeper within the forest. I hesitated for a moment, fear warring with an irresistible pull of curiosity. Then I started walking towards the sound drawn by an unseen force. The singing led me through the trees, deeper and deeper into the wilderness. The forest grew darker and more ancient, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels. Finally, I reached a small clearing. In the center of the clearing, bathed in the soft glow of the morning sun, was the large grey wolf I had encountered before. It was standing upright, its obsidian eyes gleaming. It looked at me, and then it spoke. This time, the words were clearer, as if I was beginning to understand the language. It spoke of ancient pacts and forgotten rituals, of a power that had slumbered for centuries beneath the mountains, now stirring once more. It spoke of a connection between the land, the wolves, and something else, something old and powerful that dwelled in the deepest parts of the park. It told me that the changes I was seeing were a sign, a harbinger of something to come. The balance of the natural world was shifting, and the wolves were acting as intermediaries, conduits for this ancient power. The wolf then gestured with its paw towards the surrounding forest. "You are a guardian of this place," it said, its voice resonating with an ancient wisdom. "You must understand what is happening, and you must be ready for what is to come." Then it turned and walked into the trees, disappearing silently into the shadows. I stood there for a long time, trying to process what I had just heard. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture that was emerging was more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The strange behavior of the wolves wasn't just a random occurrence. It was part of something larger, something ancient and powerful that was awakening in the Appalachian National Park. And I, a simple park ranger, was now somehow caught in the middle of it. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know what this ancient power is or what it wants. But I know that the park, and perhaps the world, is about to change in ways we can't even begin to comprehend. I will continue my patrols. I will continue to watch the woods. And I will be ready for whatever comes next, because in the heart of the Appalachian wilderness, something has awakened. And the wolves are no longer just wolves. They are something else entirely. And their time is coming. This is Ben Carter, signing off. I have a feeling this is just the beginning, and I am terrified of what the end might look like.